Hello and welcome. I want to continue with our kind of exploration about this concept of learning. You recall that we've couched learning in terms of a cyclic process, the brain and various other ways. We've looked at learning in a variety of ways, and I want to add yet another perspective on learning. And that is to think about something called the inquiry process. Now, before we get started on that process, though, I want to do some defining here. What does inquiry mean? Inquiry means to ask for information, the act of asking for information, and the process of finding answers to questions. So this is really what we're talking about, the process of finding answers to questions. So from our perspective and how we think about the inquiry process and relate it to our teaching and our students' learning, this is really what we're talking about. The products of inquiry, however, may look different depending upon what discipline you are in. So, for example, a couple of extremes: art, say someone developing a dance, versus science, maybe they're writing a science paper or something like that. So the products of inquiry are going to be different. The process, on the other hand, is pretty much the same regardless of what the discipline is. So this is transferable across disciplines, but the way you specifically apply it may be a bit different, and certainly the products may be very different. Okay, some other thoughts about inquiry and the inquiry process. Inquiry-based learning, sometimes this is called. UNESCO, it is not the answer that enlightens, but the question. Many times in our teaching, we focus on, does the student know the answer to a question that we pose to them? How often do we ask our students, what's the question? What's the best question? Have you ever wondered about something? So that's really kind of what we're trying to do here, is to get away from only thinking about what are the answers, but also getting students to think about what are the questions? What are the best questions to ask? What are the correct questions to ask? This is an important point, and we'll come back to this a number of times in this video. People construct knowledge based on the questions that arise in their lived experience. And you know this, it doesn't take that long for you to step back and think about this. As we learn, we are always putting that information back in the context of what we either already know or what we have experienced in our lives. You're going to find that it's a cyclic process. So, hey, yet another cycle. Here we go. This actually comes from something that's called the inquiry page. That page actually does not exist anymore online, but this was developed by Chip Bruce and Ann Bishop when they were both at the University of Illinois. They're both elsewhere at this point. So let's get into this cycle. So what I want you to do is take a piece of paper, blank piece of paper, and I want you to draw this pentagon with circles at each of the corners and then arrows going in this direction. So blank piece of paper, draw the 5 circles like that with arrows connecting each of those. And again, it's going to go in this direction. Once you've got that done, then we're going to start filling these in and giving you some additional information on what are these steps or components of the inquiry cycle. With any cycle, we can start at any point, but we're going to start at the top, or here, I should say, with the word ask. So the first component, or a key component of the inquiry cycle, is to ask. And again, I get back to this statement. People construct knowledge based on the questions that arise in their lived experience. Our students walk into our modules on day 1 during the semester. They're novices. They may have a little bit of background knowledge, but very likely they have very limited, if any, lived experience related to the things we're going to teach them during that semester. We need to keep that in mind as we think about this. All right, so again, I'm going to say this one again. People construct knowledge based upon the questions that arise in their lived experience. Again, we all do this all the time. Once that question's been defined, whatever that question is, then we want to investigate. Well, that's pretty obvious. We do that all the time. Now, I've couched these other ideas here in the context of what would we provide the students to encourage them or to help them think through this process. So we're asking them, okay, student, what key words will you use to initiate your investigation? How are you going to start your search for information? What strategy are you going to use, student, to conduct your investigation? And then what resources will you use or need for your investigation? So again, we're putting this in the context of helping a student understand and get started on this part of the inquiry process right here called investigate. They ask the question has been defined, now they're going to start the investigation. Well, here's some things they need to know is what are the keywords to start, what are the strategies they're going to use, and what are the resources they're going to use. Once the investigation's done, then they're going to come up with some sort of a product. They're going to create something. A term paper, a presentation, a performance, whatever the case may be. So again, getting the students to think about this process, we're going to ask them, what conclusions have you drawn from your investigation? What products are you intending to produce or create in order to share that with others? Right off the bat, we start to recognize that this thing's going to go beyond simply one person and the brain process and the brain learning and all that kind of stuff. It's going to expand out to other people. In fact, that is the next step, to discuss. Pose the question, investigate, come up with a product, share that with others, and that's where the discuss comes in. So in this case, how do you intend to share what you have learned and your conclusions? And what outcome do you expect from sharing, discussing what you have learned and your conclusions with others? So how are you going to share this? We don't typically ask our students to simply, let's say they're writing a term paper. We do at least, at the very minimum, ask them to share that with us, right? So there's some very minimal level of discussion or feedback and so on. So how are they going to do that? They're not just going to make it and then put it away on the shelf in a drawer or something. Somehow they're going to share that product. And then what's the outcome you expect from that in terms of getting that feedback? So that's the discuss part, and this is where it starts to take us away from simply one person doing something, because whatever they're doing in their inquiry process, they're sharing with other people and getting feedback from those other people, which leads us to our next step, and that is once we have that feedback, once we have shared it, once we have discussed whatever that product is, that creation is with other people, we get feedback and we're going to reflect upon that feedback. So we're going to ask the student, or pose this to the student, what did you learn from sharing, discussing what you have learned and your conclusions? What did you learn from other people? And how does that discussion affect your understanding of what you have learned and your conclusions? How does that affect your understanding of what you have done and what this process is? This is where they talk about, again, extracting meaning. Now, again, I'm the one doing the reflection. I did this, I shared it with other people, and now I'm reflecting, and now it's mine. It's something new for me, all right? It's not just a term paper that I've turned in and I walk away from. Oh, this is something new and interesting for me. This brings us right back to where we started, except that it's a different question. We're coming up with a different question. So based upon your reflection, like over here, of your initial inquiry cycle, that first cycle, what further question or questions or additional questions have arisen which deserve another cycle of inquiry? Now, as a scientist, and those of you who work in science, and I'm sure this is true for many other fields as well, but certainly when we do an experiment, when we do a study, we publish that study, we start with a question, a hypothesis. All right, we hopefully answer that question in our process, but we all know from experience that simply begets 2 or 3 additional questions. It's always ongoing. We're always discovering something, we're always going on further. And that's going to be true, again, in the inquiry process, regardless of what someone's doing. So it's important not just to go these steps, these 5 steps, but you need to bring it back and start another inquiry process. This is where we get into this cycle idea. Okay, again, I come back to this idea of people construct knowledge based upon questions that arise from their lived experience. So let's apply this to something that we're probably all fairly familiar with the idea of a term paper, some sort of a paper that the students are supposed to produce, and they're supposed to go through the inquiry process. But the reality is this. Let me back up one, because we often do not do this or allow the students to ask the question in the context of their lived experience. They may be doing it in the context of your module and content in your module, but if they've never lived anything, if that's not part of their lived experience, it's not the same thing as if they can somehow relate it directly to their lived experience. So typically what happens is we're not asking the question in the context of some lived experience. They're being assigned a topic, or maybe they just choose a topic out of certain potential topics, and they investigate and they create, write the term paper, and they turn it into you, and maybe they get some feedback, but that's it. It doesn't go very much further than that. It's pretty rare that then they discuss that with others, their colleagues, their contemporaries, their family, their friends, whatever the case may be, get some feedback, go to that next step, the reflect step, and then bring it back around again. So typically the way we've done things with regard to term papers is only doing part of the cycle, and it's really not doing it all that well. Yes, they do investigate, they do come up with some product, but it really does not bring this around and complete the cycle. So, a couple of other examples. So a classic term paper, organization. So what I'm getting at here is the organization. What organization do you expect from your students when you give them a task, an assignment, a project, something like that? Many times it comes into the classic term paper organization. There's a title, there's an introduction, that includes a thesis statement or what is the problem or question to be addressed, some sort of transition into the body, then first supporting topic with supporting details and examples, second supporting topic, third supporting topic, a conclusion, they draw a conclusion, they somehow synthesize everything together, conclusion of the thesis, and basically then restate the main topic and subtopic. So it's very straightforward, cut and dried, straightforward, but this is all about the product. It's all about that create part. It's not necessarily about the process. Classic scientific paper. It's a title, an abstract or a summary, introduction, materials and methods, results, discussion of those results and what it means, hopefully, and then your conclusions and then your references. Again, typically this is all about the product. So a lot of times when I've worked with graduate students, I need to help them understand that when they read that scientific paper, they're reading the polished product of a lot of things that went on that never show up in the paper. All those little partial experiments that were done that didn't work, they did this experiment, it did not work, well, that's not going to get in the paper. This experiment, it did not work, that's not going to get in the paper. Oh, this one did work. That's the one that ends up in the paper. And so the process, unless it's extremely well written and you know how to interpret that, again, it's really more about the product. It's what are the results from that experiment and then what are your conclusions. It's not about the process. That's fine. If you're publishing in scientific literature, for example, this is what you have to do. But for our students, we want them to engage in the inquiry process. We want this to become natural to them, to understand this cycle. So rather than giving them those structures of organization for what they're going to do, let's be very explicit about this. Give them this, say, okay, you identify, ask, what was the question and why did you ask that question? And hopefully give them some leeway to ask it on the basis of their lived experience. Investigate, what did you find? We often do that. What was your strategy for investigating and what resources did you use? We often don't ask them those second two questions, or at least not the middle question. What was your strategy? How did you go about doing that? We just see the end product of that strategy. Create. What did you create out of your findings and why was that the creation you chose? Why did you choose to write a paper this way? Why did you choose to produce a piece of art in this way? Be very explicit. Ask them to be very explicit and why did they do that. Discuss, how did you share your work with others? Hopefully they shared their work with others if you encourage them to do that. And then what was the outcome of that sharing? Perhaps they shared it with a family member or a colleague or something, or a fellow student, and the student says, well, you know, you missed this point. Well, here's where that comes out is, oh, I didn't get that. And now I need to go back and redo this product a little bit. I need to fix some things. And so this is the part where you get feedback from other people, and that feedback wraps back into what you're doing. Again, reflect. What did you learn? And particularly, what did you learn about the process? Not just what are your conclusions from what you learned, the content, but rather what's the process, learning about the process. And how do you think differently about the question? A lot of times we go through this inquiry process with a framework in our minds about a question, and we get through everything, and oh, you know, I realized that I wasn't thinking about that question correctly, or I need to think about that question in a different way. So here you're very explicitly asking them, how do you think differently about your starting point, that starting question? And then again, this is something I often, for graduate students, for example, when they're writing their thesis and so on, is what's the next question? Okay, you carved out your question, you've done your experiments, you've got your conclusions and results. What's the next most important question? Sometimes I tell them, okay, you've done all this, now someone's going to give you $100,000 to continue the research. What is the next most important thing to do that we need to know? What's the next most important question that needs to be answered? And that should have arisen from the earlier inquiry process. So again, what is the next question that arises from your reflection? Now, also recognize, because they've gone through this personally, this question definitely should come from their lived experience. This is their lived experience now. First time around, maybe yes, maybe no, but now they really have something to base that next inquiry cycle on. So how are they starting to think about if they went forward with another inquiry cycle? Again, this way of asking the students to organize their report or whatever you're going to have them do is really more about the process, which is what, again, we're teaching them about the process. That's what we are doing as educators. The product is important, absolutely, but we often undervalue the students' understanding and being explicit in terms of what was the process that they used. Okay, so this is our inquiry process. Ask, investigate, create, discuss, reflect, ask. We like any cycle, we can start at any point. Maybe we were sitting in, or maybe your students were sitting talking with each other about some assignment or some activity that they had done or something that you had taught about in your module. And one of the students reflects upon that discussion and says, oh, I have a question. I wondered about something that the instructor was talking about that we really hadn't talked about. Oh, maybe, hey, that make a good question, and we're going to investigate. So we can start at any point here. Typically, in terms of teaching this, we often start at this point. What is the ask? Okay, I have an assignment for you. What I would like you to do is think in terms of one of the modules you teach. Probably you may already be doing something of this nature in your upper level, your third and fourth year, for your third and fourth year students. But it's good to introduce the first and second year students to this idea of inquiry as a process. Consider some major assignment that you already give to your students, some term paper, project, whatever the case may be, that you do it the way you do it now. And then how would you modify that assignment or project in a way that helps the students focus on the process of inquiry and that explicitly incorporates the steps of the inquiry process? So again, being more explicit, that's not to say undervalue the product, it is to say also value this process, this cycle that we're talking about, this cycle. So somehow integrating that in more explicitly so that students will go through the whole thing, not just 2 or 3 steps. So again, identify something you're already doing, but then how would you modify that to more explicitly integrate the inquiry process? Good luck.